It began not with an explosion, but with a whisper. In the bitter cold streets of Petrograd, where mothers stood in bread lines that never ended, and children cried from hunger louder than the church bells. A crumbling empire still pretending to be divine, and a people who had nothing left to lose. Russia, once ruled by the iron will of the Tsars, stood at the edge of something no one fully understood, not even those leading it. This was not a simple rebellion. This was a seismic shift in the very fabric of history, the kind of event that tears apart everything that came before and reshapes what comes after. The Russian Revolution did not just topple a monarchy. It dismantled centuries of power, tradition, and identity. And in its place, it raised a new kind of empire, founded not on crowns and crosses, but on red banners, clenched fists, and ruthless ideology. What does it take for a society to devour its own gods? What kind of fire consumes a nation so completely that even victory looks like ruin? This is not just the story of Lenin or the Tsar. This is the story of revolution, violent, relentless, and unforgiving. This is the Russian Revolution. At the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire was not merely a nation. It was a vast, lumbering colossus, spanning over 1/6 of the Earth's landmass. From the frozen tundras of Siberia to the glittering palaces of St. Petersburg, it seemed unconquerable, immovable, eternal. But beneath its heavy robes of gold and snow-white orthodoxy, its foundation was crumbling, quietly, fatally. This was a land where ancient feudal chains still gripped the legs of millions. Though the serfs had been officially emancipated in 1861, the reality of freedom never reached the fields. Peasants remained shackled to the soil, broken by debt, their backs bent under the weight of generations of toil. Over 80% of the population were peasants, poor, hungry, and voiceless. Their lives were marked by hunger in the winter, sweat in the summer, and silence in between. Above them stood the aristocracy, a ruling class insulated by wealth, opulence, and absolute privilege. Tsar Nicholas II, the monarch of this empire, was a man of deep faith but little foresight. He saw himself not just as a ruler, but as God's chosen guardian of Russia. He believed in the divine right of kings, unquestioned authority handed down from heaven itself. But history does not bend to belief, and faith alone cannot govern a starving nation. The early signs of collapse were everywhere. Industrialization had arrived late in Russia and struck like a storm. Massive factories rose in cities like Moscow and Petrograd, pulling peasants from their villages into the grinding gears of industry. These workers toiled 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, in suffocating conditions for pitiful wages. There were no unions, no labor protections, and no hope. Their hands built the new Russia, but their cries went unheard. Politically, Russia was an iron cage. The Tsar held supreme power. There was no constitution, no true parliament, no mechanism for peaceful change. The secret police, the Okhrana, roamed the cities like shadows, arresting, torturing, and silencing any voice of dissent. Censorship blanketed the press. Surveillance poisoned public gatherings. Even whispers could earn you a one-way ticket to Siberia. But repression breeds resistance. And by the end of the 1800s, new ideas began to bloom like cracks in the ice. The writings of Karl Marx found their way into Russia's underground, inspiring a new generation of revolutionaries. These radicals did not speak of reform. They spoke of destruction, of tearing down the old world to build a new one in its place. From university cells to underground newspapers, a fire began to smolder. Among the growing revolutionary movement, one man stood out. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to history as Lenin, was a hardened, brilliant, and utterly uncompromising figure. Exiled, hunted, but never silenced, he believed that only a vanguard of professional revolutionaries could guide the working class to true liberation. He would become the mind and voice of the storm to come. But for now, he waited, watched, and sharpened his resolve in exile. Then came the first shockwave, the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. Believing they could crush Japan with ease, the Russian Empire marched to war with pride. But what followed was disaster. Russia's navy was obliterated, its army humiliated, and its people enraged. The myth of imperial strength shattered. Defeat at the hands of an inferior Asian power was more than military failure. It was a national humiliation. What followed was chaos. In 1905, protests erupted in Petrograd as workers demanded better conditions, political representation, and an end to corruption. On January 22nd, thousands of unarmed men, women, and children marched toward the Winter Palace, led by a priest named Father Gapon. They carried religious icons and humble petitions, believing the Tsar would listen. He did not. Imperial troops opened fire. Hundreds were gunned down in the snow. The event became known as Bloody Sunday, and it changed everything. Faith in the Tsar as father of the people died that day. The empire was plunged into months of strikes, uprisings, and mutinies. The 1905 revolution had begun. Tsar Nicholas was forced to offer concessions. He created the Duma, a legislative assembly meant to pacify the people. But it was a lie. The Duma had no real power. Nicholas dismissed it whenever it challenged him. The gesture was hollow, and the people knew it. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, and they would not die quietly. As the years crawled forward, Russia became a nation in waiting. The working class was angry. The peasants were starving. The intellectuals were restless. The revolutionaries were watching. And high above them all, the Romanovs danced in palaces, still believing in eternity. But history does not wait for kings to awaken. The Romanov dynasty, once draped in the sacred shroud of divine rule, had entered the twilight of its reign, but it could not see the darkness creeping in. While the palaces of St. Petersburg still echoed with chandeliers and courtly music, the countryside burned with hunger and despair. And beyond the borders of the empire, the world itself was changing, faster than Russia could bear. The early 20th century was a cauldron of rising empires, shifting ideologies, and global tension. In Western Europe, constitutional monarchies and parliamentary systems were taking root. The industrial age had brought education, mobility, and a hunger for self-determination to millions. Russia, by contrast, remained frozen in a feudal past. The divide between the aristocracy and the masses widened not just economically, but emotionally. The people no longer believed in the benevolence of the Tsar. They believed in justice, on their terms. Meanwhile, in secret chambers, in prison cells, in faraway cafes in Geneva and Paris, the revolution was being imagined. Russian exiles and radical thinkers, from anarchists to Marxists, debated, published, and plotted. The socialist movement fractured into rival factions. The Bolsheviks, who believed in gradual reform through mass participation, and the Bolsheviks, under Lenin, who saw revolution as a war to be won by a disciplined elite. The ideological war had begun before the real one ever did. Still, even the most radical revolutionaries could not foresee what would come next, because what tore Russia apart was not a pamphlet or protest. It was a war that would grind the world to dust. In 1914, Tsar Nicholas II made a fatal decision. He led Russia into World War I. The empire marched into battle with grandeur and pride, declaring itself the protector of Slavic nations and Orthodox faith. but it was tragically unprepared for modern warfare. Russia's soldiers were brave but under-equipped. Many were sent to the front with no rifles, told to pick up the weapons of the fallen. Food was scarce, medical care was primitive, morale shattered under the weight of industrial slaughter. The war turned the cracks of the empire into canyons. The front lines were a disaster, but so was the home front. Cities faced chronic shortages of bread and fuel. Inflation soared. Factories collapsed. Trains carrying supplies broke down, and the Tsarina, Alexandra, placed her trust in a mystic named Rasputin, whose growing influence at court scandalized and enraged the nation. As soldiers died in the trenches by the hundreds of thousands, the people asked the one question that would change everything. Why? Why were they starving while the elites dined in luxury? Why were their sons bleeding on foreign soil for an empire that gave them nothing? Why was God silent? Why was the Tsar blind? In the cold, miserable winter of 1917, the answer came. It did not come from a gunshot or a manifesto. It came from bread, or rather, the absence of it. In February of 1917, women textile workers in Petrograd took to the streets demanding food. Their protest sparked a chain reaction. Workers walked out of factories. Students joined them. Soldiers, ordered to suppress the unrest, refused, and in many cases, turned their rifles on their officers. The capital descended into chaos, but it was not anarchy. It was awakening. The Duma, sensing the empire unraveling, pleaded with the Tsar to respond. But Nicholas was at the front, far from the reality of his crumbling empire. By the time he returned, it was too late. The monarchy, once unquestionable, had become irrelevant. On March 2, 1917, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule vanished. There was no grand final battle. No divine sign, no royal martyrdom, only a signature and silence. But the end of the monarchy did not bring peace. It brought uncertainty. The provisional government, hastily formed by liberal elites, tried to stabilize the nation. They promised elections, civil rights, and reforms. But they made one fatal mistake. They continued the war. The people wanted bread and peace. The government gave them speeches and sacrifice. The patience of the masses wore thin. In the background, the Bolsheviks began to move. Their slogans were simple but powerful. Peace, land, and bread. All power to the Soviets. Lenin, now returned from exile in a sealed train arranged by the Germans, saw his moment. The provisional government, he argued, was just a mask for the old regime. Only a true proletarian revolution, led by the working class, could save Russia from ruin. By the summer of 1917, the streets of Petrograd were once again teetering on the edge. Soviets, workers' councils, had formed across the country, becoming rival centers of power. The army was disintegrating. The countryside was erupting in land seizures. The people no longer looked to the government. They looked to the revolution. Russia was no longer a monarchy, but it was not yet a republic. It was something else entirely. A wounded beast staggering through fire, with no master and no map. And in the shadows, Lenin watched, waiting for the moment to strike. The Romanovs had fallen, but the revolution had not yet begun. What swept through Russia in early 1917 was not the final wave, but only the tremor before the earthquake. The Tsar was gone, but power, true power, still hung in the air, unclaimed. And in that dangerous vacuum, new players emerged from the shadows. The streets of Petrograd, still filled with marching workers and rumbling tanks, became a battleground of ideology, will, and blood. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, promised Russia a liberal future, free speech, political participation, and eventual elections. But to the starving soldiers and workers, these promises sounded like delay. The war raged on, and with it, the death toll soared. Russian soldiers were now deserting by the thousands, choosing hunger over the meat grinder of the front lines. Meanwhile, peasants began seizing land from aristocrats, burning estates and carving their own justice into the countryside. There was no turning back. Russia was unraveling, and the provisional government was too weak to hold it together. In this chaos, one voice rose above the rest, a voice cold, methodical, and unwavering: Vladimir Lenin. Returned from exile in Switzerland with German help, Lenin's arrival in Petrograd was nothing short of a political thunderclap. To the disillusioned, the broken, and the enraged, he was not just a man, he was the revolution. And unlike Kerensky's vague rhetoric, Lenin spoke in absolutes. No compromise, no negotiation. The war must end. Land must be given to the peasants. Power must be handed to the Soviets, the councils of workers and soldiers who had begun governing themselves without permission. It was not a call for reform. It was a call for insurrection. Through the spring and summer of 1917, the Bolsheviks expanded their influence. Their newspaper, Pravda, reached more readers every day. Their slogans painted the walls of cities. Peace, land, and bread was not just propaganda. It was a promise, and one the desperate masses clung to. But power does not pass peacefully from hand to hand. The provisional government, terrified of Lenin's growing momentum, tried to silence the Bolsheviks. During the July Days uprising, when tens of thousands of workers and soldiers took to the streets demanding power. For the Soviets, Kerensky's forces cracked down. Bolshevik leaders were arrested. Lenin fled to Finland, disguised in a wig and spectacles. For a moment it seemed the revolution had faltered, but revolutions, like fires, often burn brighter after a gust of wind. While the provisional government focused on suppressing dissent, another threat rose from within the military. General Laver Kornilov, a conservative monarchist, marched his troops toward Petrograd in August 1917, intending to restore order, which many feared meant restoring dictatorship. Kerensky, desperate, turned to the very Bolsheviks he had tried to destroy. He armed the Red Guards, the workers' militia, and begged for their help. It was a fatal mistake. The Bolsheviks, armed and legitimized, now stood not as radicals, but as saviors of the revolution. Kornilov's coup collapsed without bloodshed, but its aftermath changed everything. The people no longer trusted Kerensky. They turned fully to the Soviets, and the Soviets, now dominated by Bolsheviks, turned toward insurrection. By October, the time had come. Lenin returned to Petrograd in secret. Trotsky, his brilliant and charismatic ally, took command of the Red Guards. Plans were drawn, targets chosen, orders whispered in factory halls and soldiers' barracks. This would not be a storming of gates. It would be precise, clinical, inevitable. On the night of October 25, 1917, November 7th in the new calendar, Bolshevik forces moved swiftly. Key bridges were seized, government buildings occupied, railways, telegraphs, and power stations cut off. The Winter Palace, seat of the provisional government, was surrounded. Inside, Kerensky had fled. The remaining ministers sat in the dim halls of imperial splendor, waiting for the end. Red Guards burst in, barely a shot fired, and just like that, the Second Russian Revolution, the October Revolution, was complete. A single volley of the Aurora battleship had signaled the beginning. By dawn, Lenin stood before the Congress of Soviets and declared what would echo across the world: "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." In less than a year, the Russian Empire had gone from absolute monarchy to liberal republic, to the world's first communist state. But revolutions are not declared in speeches. They are fought in the rubble of collapsing systems, fed by blood and betrayal. The Bolsheviks had seized power, but keeping it would cost more than anyone could imagine. Revolutions promise paradise, but they are born in the furnace of chaos. After the swift takeover of Petrograd, it would have been easy to believe that the Bolsheviks had secured control of Russia. The Winter Palace had fallen, the provisional government had been dismantled, and Lenin stood triumphant at the helm of a new world. But outside Petrograd, the country was not yet convinced. The revolution had only begun its long and bloody descent. The Bolsheviks moved quickly to consolidate their fragile grip on power. One of their first acts was to issue the Decree on Peace, an immediate call to end Russia's involvement in the Great War. Soldiers, who had fought and died for years in the freezing trenches of the Eastern Front, heard the message loud and clear. They began abandoning the front lines in droves, returning to their villages, often armed and leaderless, desperate to find their families and some remnant of peace. But peace is never free. To secure it, Lenin turned to the unthinkable: negotiations with the enemy. In December 1917, talks began with Germany at Brest-Litovsk. The terms were brutal. Germany demanded vast swaths of Russian territory: Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, even parts of Poland. To many Russians, it felt like betrayal. A revolution meant to liberate now threatened to dismember their motherland. Inside the Bolshevik ranks, the leadership fractured. Trotsky, ever the idealist, refused to sign away Russia's soul. He argued for a delay, hoping that revolution would soon spread to Germany and Austria. But Lenin was unmoved. He believed survival required sacrifice. "Let us sign the peace," he said, "even if it is a death sentence." The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed in March 1918, and the backlash was immediate. Across Russia, outrage turned to action. Former allies turned enemies. The Bolsheviks, who had promised to end war, now found themselves plunged into a new one: civil, brutal, and boundless. The Russian Civil War was not a two-sided conflict. It was a labyrinth of shifting allegiances and bitter vendettas. On one side stood the Reds, the Bolsheviks, armed with ideology, discipline, and ruthless determination. On the other stood the Whites, a loose coalition of monarchists, liberals, nationalists, and foreign interventionists, united only by their hatred of Bolshevism. But there was a third force too: the peasants, the workers, the anarchists, those who had dreamed of revolution but found themselves crushed beneath its wheels. In Ukraine, the legendary Nestor Makhno led black-flagged anarchist armies, fighting both red and white in defense of local self-rule. In Siberia, Cossack warlords carved out their own kingdoms. Entire regions became lawless frontiers of death and survival. The Bolsheviks responded with fire and iron. The Cheka, the secret police, was unleashed upon the people. Mass arrests, executions, and disappearances became tools of state policy. The Red Terror, as it came to be known, was not just a response to rebellion. It was a strategy. Lenin believed fear could be a revolutionary weapon, and he wielded it without hesitation. Yet even as violence tore through the countryside, the Bolsheviks moved to reshape Russian life from the roots up. Land was nationalized, banks seized, churches shuttered or destroyed. The old order, aristocracy, religion, capitalism, was not simply overthrown. It was hunted to extinction, and still, the fighting raged on. In the south, General Anton Denikin's white armies pushed north toward Moscow, threatening to choke the revolution in its cradle. In the east, Admiral Kolchak declared himself supreme ruler of Russia, leading a campaign backed by British and American arms. In the north, Allied troops landed in Arkhangelsk, hoping to reopen the Eastern Front and reinstall a friendly government. But the Bolsheviks had one weapon no enemy could match: organization. Under Trotsky's relentless leadership, the Red Army was forged into a professional force, ruthless, disciplined, and loyal to the revolution. Former Tsarist officers were forced to serve under Bolshevik watch. Commissars ensured ideological purity. Every retreat was punished, every victory used as propaganda fuel. By late 1919, the tide had turned. The Whites, fractured and fighting among themselves, lost momentum. Corruption and brutality alienated the very people they claimed to defend. In contrast, the Reds, though no less violent, promised a future, however distant or uncertain. That promise was enough. One by one, the White strongholds fell. Kolchak was captured and executed. Denikin fled. The Allies, exhausted and confused, withdrew. The Civil War, though not yet finished, had already crowned its victor. But at what cost? By the time the last gun fell silent, millions were dead. Cities were in ruins. Famine stalked the land like a ghost, claiming lives faster than bullets. The revolution had consumed not only its enemies, but much of the nation it claimed to save. Still, for Lenin and his inner circle, it was worth it. The Bolsheviks had not just survived. They had triumphed, and now, with the empire broken and the old world reduced to ash, they would build something new. A workers' state, a global model, the Soviet Union. The revolution had passed its test of fire, but peace would not last long. Revolutions do not stay contained. They escalate, they spiral, they consume. And in the case of Russia, the revolution did not simply burn. It detonated into something far more violent, far more relentless. The Bolsheviks had seized power, yes, but now they had to hold it. And the forces aligned against them were not only domestic, they were global. By early 1919, Russia was a fractured, bleeding nation. The Bolsheviks had carved out a stronghold in the center, Moscow and Petrograd, and began calling it the Red Heartland. But beyond those borders, chaos reigned. Monarchists, liberals, Cossacks, foreign powers, all converged to crush Lenin's vision before it could mature. From the icy ports of the north to the windswept steppe of Siberia, war engulfed the land, and the Bolsheviks knew. The survival of the revolution hinged on one single thing: total control. At the center of this escalation stood Leon Trotsky, the fiery orator turned military architect. With the Red Army under his direction, he turned ideology into discipline. He traveled by armored train, a mobile command center that raced from front to front, spreading orders, enforcing discipline, and executing betrayal. Under Trotsky, the Red Army was no longer a ragtag band of peasants. It was a force of will, iron, and fear. But the enemy was formidable. In the south, General Denikin led a massive white offensive from the Caucasus. His forces surged toward Moscow in mid-1919, capturing city after city, threatening to strangle the revolution at its core. In the east, Admiral Kolchak had declared himself supreme ruler of Russia, ruling from Omsk and pushing westward with the full support of British supplies and American dollars. In the north, Allied forces from Britain, France, and the United States landed in Arkhangelsk, hoping to reopen the Eastern Front and restore the monarchy. The Bolsheviks found themselves surrounded, but it was in that desperate hour that they discovered their greatest strength, their ability to adapt and to unleash terror without hesitation. The Cheka, now a nationwide machine, silenced dissent with brutal efficiency. Spies were everywhere. Whispers were enough to get a man shot. Entire towns were burned for suspected sympathy to the whites. Villages were emptied, food was requisitioned, and terror became policy. Yet even amidst this brutality, the Bolsheviks kept one message alive. They were building a better world. They were fighting for the future. And this vision, this unshakable belief in utopia through revolution, was what turned the tide. In the winter of 1919, Denikin's advance stalled, supply lines collapsed, discipline cracked. His forces, disjointed and divided by internal rivalries, began to wither under the pressure of the Red Army's counteroffensives. Trotsky pounced, city by city, rail line by rail line. The Reds pushed southward, retaking lost ground in a brutal wave of blood and steel. In the east, Kolchak's position grew weaker. Despite his early momentum, his regime was plagued by infighting, corruption, and a lack of popular support. He had promised to restore order, but what the people saw was repression. His enemies closed in. In early 1920, Kolchak was betrayed by the Czechoslovak Legion, former POWs who had once fought for him, and handed over to the Bolsheviks. He was summarily executed. His dream of a white Russia died with him. Meanwhile, foreign intervention faltered. Allied troops, unsure of their mission and deeply unpopular among local populations, found themselves isolated and confused. They faced hostile terrain, uncertain allies, and a resurgent Red Army. Political will back home began to crumble. One by one, the foreign powers began to withdraw. Russia's civil war would be decided not by outsiders, but by Russians. And as the enemies of the revolution retreated or were annihilated, Lenin made one thing clear. This was not just a war for control. It was a war for the soul of humanity. To the Bolsheviks, every victory was not merely military, it was ideological. Each city reclaimed from the whites was a triumph of the proletariat over imperialism. Each railroad secured was a lifeline for socialism. And with every enemy crushed, their myth grew, that the revolution was invincible, that history was on their side, and that this suffering was merely the price of a better tomorrow. But as Moscow celebrated victory after victory, the countryside groaned under the weight of war. Grain requisitions left millions starving. The peasants who had once cheered the fall of the Tsar now turned against their new masters. Uprisings flared across the Volga. In Tambov, an entire region erupted into rebellion. The Bolsheviks answered with gas, fire, and mass executions. Victory had not brought peace. It had only revealed the next battlefield. Because deep inside this storm of war, something else was brewing. Not among the soldiers or the generals, but among the workers, the sailors, the very people who had once lifted Lenin to power. Their revolution, they felt, had been stolen. And soon, they would rise. The storm had not passed. It had merely shifted direction. By 1921, the Russian Civil War was nearing its end. The major white armies had collapsed. Trotsky's Red Army stood triumphant across a devastated land. The cities were red, the borders sealed, and the revolution, at least in appearance, had survived. But in that apparent silence, the ground began to tremble again, this time from within. Because the revolution had not only devoured its enemies, it had begun devouring its children. It started in Kronstadt, the frozen naval fortress near Petrograd, where sailors had once raised the red flag in 1917. They had been the revolution's vanguard, its fiercest defenders, hailed by Lenin himself as the pride and glory of the Bolshevik cause. But by 1921, they had seen too many betrayals, too many executions, too much starvation. And now they rose again, but not for Lenin, against him. The Kronstadt rebellion was a cry of pain. The sailors demanded freedom of speech, the end of one-party rule, new elections, and a return to the original ideals of the revolution: justice, equality, liberty. They called the Bolsheviks tyrants. They warned that the revolution had become a prison. Lenin's answer was swift, cold, and merciless. In March 1921, the Red Army launched an assault on the ice-covered fortress, braving machine guns, snow, and bitter cold to crush the mutiny. After 10 days of brutal fighting, Kronstadt fell. Thousands were executed. Thousands more were sent to labor camps. It was a massacre, not just of men, but of ideals. And it was not the only one. Across Russia, peasant uprisings erupted like wildfires. The countryside, ravaged by grain requisitions and famine, was choking on its own suffering. In the Volga Basin, entire villages were starving. Parents buried their children in mass graves. The winter of 1921-1922 became one of the worst humanitarian disasters in Russian history. The Bolsheviks had promised bread, land, and peace. Instead, the people received war, hunger, and fear. International aid from organizations like the American Relief Administration saved millions from starvation, but even this was twisted by politics. The Bolsheviks accepted help, but they cloaked it in silence, refusing to admit weakness, even as their people collapsed from hunger. Amidst this chaos, Lenin made a sharp, strategic pivot. He knew the revolution could not survive if it continued to eat itself. In March 1921, during the 10th Party Congress, he introduced the new economic policy, NEP. It was a stunning reversal. Private trade was allowed again. Small businesses could operate. Peasants could sell their surplus grain. To the true believers, this was a betrayal, a retreat from socialism. But to Lenin, it was necessary. One step backward, he said, to take 2 steps forward. He did not care about purity. He cared about survival. And the revolution, bruised, bloodied, and compromised, survived. But this survival came at a cost. The Bolshevik state was no longer revolutionary. It had become a system of power, centralized, militarized, and enforced by terror. The ideals of 1917 had been buried beneath the weight of war, famine, and repression. And even Lenin knew it. In his final years, isolated by illness, he began to fear what the revolution had become. He feared Stalin, the man who had risen in the shadows, consolidating power, building alliances, crushing opposition with ruthless precision. Lenin, once the architect of revolution, now saw a new kind of tyranny forming, one even more dangerous. He wrote secret memos, warnings about Stalin's character, about his brutality, his hunger for control. He urged the party to remove him, but by then it was too late. Lenin died in 1924. The father of the revolution was gone, and in the vacuum that followed, a new war began, not of guns, but of politics. A silent, shadowy battle for succession. Trotsky, the hero of the Red Army, was outmaneuvered and exiled. The revolution's most brilliant strategist was pushed aside by the man he had underestimated. And that man was Joseph Stalin. By the end of the decade, Stalin would transform the Soviet Union into something far more monstrous than the Tsarist empire it replaced. A totalitarian state of purges, gulags, surveillance, and industrialized fear. The revolution had not failed. It had metastasized. Its climax had come not in a single battle, but in 1,000 silent moments, when ideals were traded for survival, when comrades became enemies, when power, once seized, refused to let go. And so the Russian Revolution, which began with the promise of freedom and justice, ended with silence. The kind of silence that comes after the last scream is choked off, the kind that echoes in prison cells and empty fields, long after the banners have fallen. But history does not end in silence. It waits, watches, and remembers. When the final echoes of revolution faded into the cold Russian sky, they left behind not triumph, but something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The empire was gone. The Tsar, his family, his ministers, all swept away by fire and bullet. But in their place stood no clear vision of peace. What emerged from the ruins of monarchy was a nation torn by contradictions, revolutionary yet authoritarian, liberated yet shackled, united by bloodshed but divided by ideology. The Bolsheviks had won the war, but now came the harder task, governing the wreckage. In 1922, a new nation was born, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, a state forged in revolution, baptized in civil war, and bound together by an unyielding ideology. Lenin called it the first true workers' state in history, but beneath that claim lay a nation in agony. Russia was in ruins, its economy shattered, its cities crumbling. Industrial output had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. The countryside was gutted, harvests stolen, villages burned, millions dead from war, famine, and disease. And trust? It was extinct. The revolution had demanded loyalty, not through love, but through fear. Every friend could become an informant. Every whisper might be your last. The Cheka, now rebranded as the GPU, watched everything. Dissenters were not debated. They were disappeared. But fear was not the only weapon. The Bolsheviks also deployed myth. They wrapped the revolution in legend, painting Lenin as the eternal leader, the revolution as inevitable, and their victory as righteous. History was rewritten in real time. Books were edited. Enemies of the revolution were erased from photographs. Even memory became dangerous. And through it all, one figure grew in the shadows: Joseph Stalin. He was not a brilliant orator like Trotsky, not a philosopher like Lenin, but he was something far more effective in the aftermath of chaos: relentless, patient, and quietly ruthless. While others argued over theory, Stalin built power: control of the party, control of appointments, control of information. By 1924, when Lenin died, Stalin was already holding the keys to the future. But the struggle for succession would not be clean. It was not a gunfight. It was a chess match, played in back rooms, whispered through corridors, and carved into speeches. Trotsky, once the hero of the Red Army, found himself isolated. His allies vanished, his policies rejected, and his warnings about Stalin fell on deaf ears. Trotsky saw what was coming. He called it the bureaucratic degeneration of the revolution, a state where the party no longer served the people, but itself. But Stalin's rise was unstoppable. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party. By 1929, he was exiled from the Soviet Union. He would spend the rest of his life on the run, from one country to another, before being hunted down and assassinated in Mexico in 1940 by a Stalinist agent. An ice axe to the skull. Not just the end of a man, but of a competing vision for what the revolution might have been. Back in the USSR, Stalin solidified his grip. He ended the new economic policy which Lenin had introduced to stabilize the economy. In its place, Stalin launched the first 5-year plan, a massive program of forced industrialization, collectivization of agriculture, and total control of the economy. Factories were built overnight. Entire cities rose from the earth. But at what cost? Peasants were driven from their land. Resistance was met with executions or deportation to labor camps. Millions died in man-made famines, most notoriously in Ukraine, where the Holodomor claimed millions of lives. It was starvation used as policy, hunger as punishment, all in the name of progress. The party that had once promised freedom became a machine of control. The revolution that had promised dignity became a system of fear. And yet, millions still believed that the suffering was temporary, that the sacrifices were necessary, that the future would justify the past. Because that is the strange power of revolution. It does not die with its victims. It lives on in slogans, in monuments, in rewritten history books. It becomes myth. But behind every myth is a truth buried in graves and silence. The aftermath of the Russian Revolution was not a period of peace. It was a continuation of war. War against dissent, against memory, against the very possibility that something else had once been imagined. And in the center of it all stood the Soviet state, unchallenged, unrepentant, and unstoppable. But history is never finished, and even in the darkest shadows of political chaos, the embers of rebellion never truly die. By the early 1930s, the Russian Revolution had completed its most terrifying transformation. What had begun as a cry for justice had become an engine of paranoia. The very revolutionaries who once shouted for equality and liberation were now silenced by the very system they helped create. Stalin, now the uncontested ruler of the Soviet Union, wielded power not like a politician, but like a force of nature. His control was absolute, and his enemies, both real and imagined, were systematically eliminated. The party, the army, the people, all were subject to his will. Between 1936 and 1938, the Great Purge descended like a storm across the Soviet Union. Top Bolsheviks, men who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Lenin, were arrested, tortured, and executed in staged show trials. Their confessions were scripted, their guilt predetermined, their deaths a performance designed to instill fear. Even those who had not spoken out were not safe. A wrong word, a suspicious glance, or the mere accusation of disloyalty could bring a knock at the door in the middle of the night. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, became the unseen executioners of a terrified society. Millions vanished. Some were shot in cold blood. Others were sent to the vast archipelago of labor camps stretching across Siberia, the Gulag, places where survival itself was rebellion, where bones became the foundation of roads, and hope froze in the ice. It was not just the powerful who suffered. Artists, writers, teachers, factory workers, no one was beyond suspicion. Even language became dangerous. Words were monitored. Thoughts were policed. Children were taught to report on their parents. Fear became the national anthem. Yet through it all, Stalin cultivated a godlike image. Statues were raised. Cities were renamed. History itself was re-engineered to present him as the true inheritor of Lenin's legacy. In truth, Stalin had turned the revolution inside out. What had once been a bottom-up movement by the oppressed had now become a top-down regime of absolute domination. The chaos of the post-revolutionary years was not a mistake, it was a strategy. Because in chaos, control can be built. In crisis, fear can be used to bind a people to power. And that is exactly what Stalin did. But the legacy of the Russian Revolution did not stop at Russia's borders. Its ideas, its fire, spread. Communist parties arose in Germany, in France, in China. In the colonies of Africa and Asia, revolutionaries looked to the Soviet Union as a model, not knowing, or choosing to ignore, the cost behind the curtain. To the West, the Soviet Union became both fascination and fear. The Red Menace, the ideological opposite of democracy. The Cold War was not born in 1947. It began here, in the ashes of 1917, when the old world crumbled and a new one was raised in red. But even within the USSR, the revolution never truly stopped. It became perpetual, a justification for every policy, every purge, every sacrifice. Generations were raised in the belief that their suffering served a greater purpose, that the blood of the past was the seed of the future, that to question the revolution was to betray the people. It is perhaps the greatest irony of all, that a revolution meant to destroy tyranny ended by perfecting it. And yet, in its terrible contradictions, it revealed something undeniable. Revolution is not a moment. It is a force. a force that does not just change governments, it changes people. It reshapes values, relationships, reality itself. It devours certainty and births new myths. For Russia, that myth would last nearly a century. From Lenin to Stalin, from Khrushchev to Gorbachev. A story told in red stars and iron walls. A dream that began with liberation and ended with silence. But the cost, that remains. In the silence of Siberian forests where bones still lie buried. In the black and white photos where missing faces mark erased lives. In the generations that grew up in fear, not of foreign armies, but of their own leaders. That is the true aftermath of the Russian Revolution. Not just a change of power, but a change in what people believed was possible, and what they feared was inevitable. As the smoke cleared and the slogans faded, the world was left asking, was it worth it? And in that question lies the eternal shadow of every revolution that follows. The Russian Revolution did not simply rewrite the story of one nation. It tore through the narrative of the entire world. Like a lightning strike across the map of history, it revealed the fragile lines between power and people, between justice and vengeance, between liberation and tyranny. What began in 1917 as an uprising against imperial cruelty became something far more complex and far more enduring. It challenged the very idea of what a government could be and what it could demand of its people. For the common Russian, the revolution was a promise, a dream of bread, land, and peace, the idea that power would finally belong to the workers, the farmers, the forgotten, that the chains of exploitation would be broken and a new society, fair and equal, would rise from the rubble of the old. But dreams built on blood rarely remain pure, and revolutions born in desperation rarely end in peace. The collapse of the Romanov dynasty, the fall of Tsar Nicholas II, was supposed to mark a new dawn. Instead, it opened a door to chaos. The provisional government, noble in its intent, lacked the will to survive the storm it inherited, and into that vacuum stepped Lenin, with clarity, with purpose, and with a vision that would shake the planet. His words were sharp, his ideology uncompromising. The Bolsheviks did not just want to reform society, they wanted to remake it, from its foundation to its highest tower. Through the eyes of the Bolshevik Revolution, the world was not broken by accident. It was broken by class. To fix it, the entire system had to burn. This radical vision, this promise of total transformation, was what made the Russian Revolution so terrifying and so inspiring. Across continents, the oppressed looked to Moscow with hope. In cities and villages from India to Latin America, revolutionaries whispered the same words that had once thundered in the streets of Petrograd. Land to the peasants, factories to the workers, power to the people. But for every whisper of hope, there was also a cry of fear for those who had seen what came next. The Cheka, the Gulag, the purges, the show trials. The revolution did not simply destroy its enemies, it devoured its own. The idealism of 1917 gave way to the cold machinery of control. Under Stalin, the state became omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. The revolution had promised equality, but delivered surveillance. It had promised dignity, but demanded obedience. It had promised peace, but waged internal war for decades. And yet, the Soviet Union survived. And in that survival, it changed the world. It became the second superpower. It launched satellites. It industrialized a continent. It stood toe-to-toe with the West in a Cold War that brought the planet to the brink of annihilation more than once. All of that because of what began in 1917. The legacy of the Russian Revolution cannot be confined to textbooks or monuments. It is etched into the DNA of the 20th century. It influenced art, science, politics, and ideology on a global scale. It challenged the dominance of capitalism. It forced democracies to confront inequality. It inspired revolutions in China, Vietnam, Cuba, and beyond. But it also left scars, deep, permanent, and often unspoken. Tens of millions suffered. Generations lived in fear. Truth was rewritten. History was weaponized, and an entire people were taught that the state was not just a protector, but a god. So what then is the legacy? Is it the bold dream of equality that lifted millions from feudal chains, or the brutal machinery of repression that crushed dissent? Is it the industrial might that modernized a vast, impoverished land, or the silence of those who vanished in its name? The truth, as always, is complicated. The Russian Revolution was not a single event. It was a series of ruptures, political, social, emotional. And like any rupture, it left fractures that never fully healed. Even today, in post-Soviet Russia, the shadows linger. Lenin still lies in a glass tomb, Stalin's name is still debated, and the people still live between memory and myth. What the revolution promised and what it delivered remain two very different stories, but both are part of the same legacy. And in that legacy, we see the power of ideas, the danger of extremes, and the price of change. The Russian Revolution was not a storm that passed and faded. It was a fault line that split the world in two. Even long after the smoke of civil war had cleared, the world continued to live in its shadow. Every ideology, every movement, every war that followed in the 20th century echoed with the spirit, or the fear, of 1917. The Soviet Union, born from revolutionary fire, stood not just as a country, but as a symbol. To some, it was the triumph of the working class over centuries of imperial oppression. To others, it was a warning of what happens when power is seized without mercy. It became both a beacon and a bludgeon, lighting the way for anti-colonial struggles, while silencing millions behind the Iron Curtain. But make no mistake, without the Russian Revolution, the modern world would not exist as we know it. America's New Deal, Europe's post-war welfare states, even China's transformation into a communist giant, all were shaped, directly or indirectly, by the tremors of 1917. It challenged capitalism. It terrified monarchies. It inspired poets and revolutionaries, while haunting exiles and dissidents. And as much as the West tried to contain or erase it, the revolution lived on, not just in policies or propaganda, but in the minds of millions who dared to believe the world could be something different, something more just. Yet history rarely gives us happy endings. As the decades rolled on, the revolution's ideals hardened into dogma. Its leaders became symbols of state rather than servants of the people. The very hierarchy it had vowed to destroy, privilege, bureaucracy, authoritarianism, rose again under new names and red flags. A revolution meant to empower the masses ultimately forged a regime where fear often ruled more firmly than freedom. The Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 seemed to mark the final death of that revolutionary dream. Statues fell, archives opened, and the world looked on as the empire built by revolution dissolved into chaos, poverty, and uncertainty. Some saw it as the triumph of democracy. Others saw it as betrayal. But history is not so simple. For all its contradictions, the Russian Revolution left behind something undeniable: the idea that ordinary people, united by vision and desperation, could rewrite their destiny, no matter how impossible it seemed. That is its most dangerous and powerful legacy, because revolutions do not end in history books. They are remembered in whispers, in graffiti on a crumbling wall, in hunger that grows in silence. in protests that begin with one voice, then thousands. Wherever people dream of justice, the Russian Revolution is there, warning, inspiring, reminding us that power, once challenged, never forgets. That freedom, once claimed, must be defended, and that history once changed can never go back. Perhaps the greatest lesson is this: revolutions are not clean. They are not fairy tales of good versus evil. They are chaos and compromise, passion and paranoia, hope and horror. They give birth to new worlds, but not always the worlds we imagined. The Russian people paid dearly for their revolution. They traded one form of oppression for another. They rebuilt their nation from ruins, only to watch it falter again. But they also sparked a global conversation that has never truly ended. What kind of world do we want to live in? Who should hold power, and why? What are we willing to risk to be free? These are the questions the revolution left us. And now, over a century later, they still echo. From the factories of Detroit to the farms of India, from the streets of Paris to the prisons of Tehran, everywhere people dream of a different life. The ghost of 1917 walks with them, not to give answers, but to ask the hardest question of all. What would you sacrifice to change everything? History is not just what we read in books. It is the fire that shaped the world we live in. The Russian Revolution was not merely an event. It was a warning, a cry for justice, and a storm that swept across generations. It showed us that freedom is never handed down. It is seized, and every gain comes with a price. Today, as new voices rise across the globe, as protests ignite and people dare to dream again, the lessons of 1917 echo louder than ever. In a world still divided by class, by power, by ideology, remembering the past is no longer a choice. It is a responsibility. So if this story moved you, if it made you think, reflect, or feel the weight of history, then do not let it end here. Subscribe to this channel for more untold revolutions, like this video to honor those who stood up when no one else would. Share it with someone who still believes in the power of people to change everything. Because history is not just behind us, it is waiting to be written by you.